Let's spend a few minutes looking at some of the high points in the history of cooperatives. The first recorded cooperative appeared in 1696. It was a fire insurance cooperative in Great Britain. Now, we don't know if cooperatives started before that and they just weren't recorded, but this was the first one that we actually had written records verifying that it existed. And the first recorded cooperative in the U.S. appeared in 1752, and that was a fire insurance cooperative started by Benjamin Franklin. And I've got a link there for you on the screen that you should be able to click if you want to learn more about that. The most noteworthy cooperative is the Rochdale Society. This was a consumer cooperative that was formed in 1844 over in England. And this cooperative has something very unique, and that was a basic set of operating rules. It was unusually successful, and because of its success, this set of operating rules was mimicked by other cooperatives, and there will be another video on cooperative principles coming up later. As a part of this history, we should look at some of the laws that regulate cooperatives, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It was not targeted specifically at cooperatives. It was targeted at companies that were working together in order to set market prices that were abnormally high. And these were firms that were engaging in anti-competitive practices. As a side effect of this law, marketing cooperatives became illegal, and you should know what a marketing cooperative is because I did put a video together that defined a marketing cooperative for you. So this law took a whole class of cooperatives and kind of put them off of the table. And that was remedied by a law called the Capper-Volstead Act of 1922. This is probably the most important piece of legislation concerning cooperatives. This law exempted cooperatives from antitrust legislation, and I would pause and I would write this down because this is pretty important and an important thing for anyone who understands cooperatives to know. These four things pop up in a lot of legislation that happened after this. A lot of cooperatives encode these four items into their incorporation documents, their bylaws and whatnot. Members must be farmers. There's usually a cap on non-member business, meaning the cooperative has to do at least half of its business with its own members. And then there's this or provision, one member, one vote, in other words, democratic control, or an 8% cap on any dividends, that's return on investment, that people who own stock in the cooperative can earn. And finally, the cooperative can't unduly enhance prices. Another important law was the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. This is the law that created all of the electric cooperatives that we see now throughout all of Tennessee. It was part of FDR's New Deal, and this law was administered through the USDA, and it provided zero interest or low interest loans to nonprofit organizations and cooperatives that were willing to run power lines into rural areas. What you have to remember is that back in the 1930s, electricity was a common thing if you lived in town, and it wasn't very profitable for a business to run power into the countryside. So cooperatives partnered with our federal government so that we could have electricity in rural areas. And this is one reason why cooperatives are a necessary form of business in our society. Cooperatives, because they're not designed to make a profit per se, they're designed to provide sometimes services or to fix a broken market in some way. Cooperatives can pop into a marketplace, they can pop up and provide a service that no one else will provide because no one else can provide it profitably. Two related laws, the Farm Credit Act of 1933 and the revision law that goes with it, 1971. Historically speaking, farmers have had a hard time getting loans from commercial banks. Commercial banks tend not to understand farming operations. And this law, which popped up again as part of FDR's New Deal back in 1933, created what we call the Farm Credit System, which was actually a system of private banks that were funded by this act that were made specifically to provide loans to farmers and people in rural areas. Now, as I just said, the law created banks that would loan money to farmers and to farmer cooperatives. In addition to this act, Roosevelt created the Farm Credit Administration in that same year. Early in its history, the Farm Credit Administration was given the authority to charter and supervise federal credit unions. Here's what's really cool. By 1968, the government money that was used to start the Farm Credit Administration had been paid back. In 1971, The revised law gave the Farm Credit Administration more flexibility. For example, it was allowed to loan money to rural homeowners for their home loan instead of just their farm loan. So if you live in a rural area and you don't farm, you can still get a loan through one of these Farm Credit Administration banks. The one that's here in Tennessee is Farm Credit of Mid-America. You can, of course, learn more about the Farm Credit Administration with the link that's on your screen.